Welcome to Teaching at Chicago V2. This is the first time, as some of you may have read in the announcements, we're doing a bit of an experiment this year. In previous years, the Teaching at Chicago was a two-day event. Many of you may have gone through it when you were TAs, and we had all of the TAs and all of the first-time instructors together for 2 days. And this year, what we're doing is we've broken the days into two, so that yesterday we could focus directly on being a TA, and I think that went really well to really, to be able to talk about being a TA without having to leave out half the group. And today, obviously, we're addressing standalone instructors so that we can talk about the things that standalone instructors do without leaving out half the group. So I hope this is an experiment. I hope it goes well. I hope you get a lot out of it. My name is Bill Rando. I'm the director of the Chicago Center for Teaching. To start off, I'm just curious to see who is here. Raise your hand and give a whoop if you're in the mood, if you're in the social sciences. Okay, I like it. Let's try that again with a whoop. Whoop. All right, okay. Raise your hand and give a whoop if you're in the BSD or PSD. Whoop! Okay. Raise your hand and give a whoop if you're in the humanities. Yay. And raise your hand and give a whoop if you're in one of the professional schools. Okay. I like it. All right. We know where the energy is in this room. Okay. So, I want to do just a couple of things before we start the formal program. I want to talk just a little bit about teaching. I want to just remind folks of the resources of the Chicago Center for Teaching, introduce you to some of our partners, and then I'll just introduce the day, which you should have picked up a notice at the table that the agenda is actually online this year instead of on paper. We're trying to do things a little greener. So it's interesting because actually when I first started working with college faculty, it was with people who are doing exactly what you're doing right now, which is teaching your own class or course for the first time. And maybe because of that, but I still think after all these years that it's a key moment in becoming the teacher that you will eventually become. I'm not saying that TAing doesn't matter. You learn a lot as a TA depending upon your situation. You may not learn a lot, but you might. But the first time that you are in front of the classroom and it's your class and your students, it is so much better. I mean, trust me. If you had any questions about whether you like teaching, love teaching, after this, you are going to love teaching. It's totally awesome. It's really great. But it's also challenging, which is why we're going to spend the day thinking about how to make this experience work. I think the greatest thing about being in front of, having your own class, even if it's a class where, if, for example, how many folks in the room are going to be teaching in the core? Hands and whoops. Ooh, okay, all right, so even if there are decisions related to the class that you're teaching, such as the case with the core, you're not making every decision. you're still making, you're still determining 80% of the experience that those students are going to have. Core classes are very varied between instructors. So what I'd like, I just want to think for a minute about the biggest question now that you get to ask and answer is, what is the one thing that you want students in your class to leave with, regardless of the decisions you can or cannot make? What is the one most important thing that you want students in your class, students who are learning with you, to leave with? Take a minute and think about that. And write it down if you have short-term memory problems. And then take a minute and turn to one or two people next to you and take 2 minutes and talk about what it is you're trying to do this quarter. What is the one way that you want students to be different by the end of your class? Take 2 minutes and do that. Yeah, and introduce yourselves to each other. All right, let's come back. What are some of the things that you're thinking, and what are some of the things that you heard from others? Let's get a sense of what it is we are all collectively up to this quarter. Yes. Cool. Making students excited about something theoretical is not always easy. But what else? What what did you hear, or what are you thinking? Oh, back there.
My conversation partner.
And tell us what you're teaching too.
Oh, I'm going to teach in the philosophical perspective sequence of the humanities course. The one class I'm teaching is in the race and ethnic studies in the college. And his goal is to teach a class more specifically situation in Southwest border to Mexico. And he said he wants to, I like it, he said he wants to, a lot of prejudices. He said there are a lot of prejudices associated with what people currently know about the situation. He wants to first of all kind of clear the ground from that. So.
Right. Part of teaching is unteaching, as you're going to find out. The ideas that students come into class with about everything, science, literature, humanity, very hard to dislodge. They've been there a long time. It's a challenge. What else? How about this side? What are you thinking about, or something that you heard that was of interest to you? Yes.
So I teach Egyptology, and I'm teaching one of the more difficult forms of the language, and having gotten feedback from people who took the course last year, they came away kind of hating it. So I would really like to have them not hate it.
Yes.
That's my primary
Score.
goal.
That's great. Not hate it. I like that. One more. Maybe from the middle.
My partner here, I liked he said he wanted to teach students the difference between facts and beliefs.
Okay.
Both of us talked more about content things.
That's okay.
Yeah, so mine was, I was an intern in the mine, and one of the things the students struggled with last year was understanding that just because something has a biological basis does not mean it's innate. And that distinction, I think, is really tough for students, and it's also really important, and I take it to heart because I'm a developmental psychologist, and I think it's kind of an important piece of our field. So that's one of my content goals for students.
That's great. Thank you. You know, it's interesting that point about in every field, or in maybe that's overstating. In nearly every field, there are what are sometimes called what's the term? There are core understandings, core concepts, which students struggle to sometimes get beyond, understanding the difference between a fact and a belief, understanding the difference between biological and innate. In history, you know, understanding basically what history is and how it's constructed. These are core ideas that if you don't come to terms with them, it shows up on everything that you do, no matter how much information you have. One of your goals this year, I think, should be to see if you can find out what those are in your field. Not just what you do that helps students learn, but what are the things in your field that students struggle with that keep them from moving to the next level? I think that's a really good question to be asking yourself as you're teaching. So I want to suggest one other goal just for you to think about, which is, and the word is standards. And what I mean by that is, I think in most classes, what we're really trying to do, and you can agree or disagree, but this is food for thought, is we're trying to move students to a higher standard of thinking, of reading, of analyzing, of understanding. They all come in with one, but it would be nice if they left with a slightly higher critical standard for themselves, for what it means to understand something, what it means to read something, what it means to write about something, or to make a claim. We do these things all the time, so you're not starting from scratch. But it would be nice if students left the class with a slightly holding themselves to a higher standard on all of those things. Think about that throughout the day. So I just want to say a couple of additional things. This is the model that we are creating for what I like to call the graduate student teaching curriculum here at University of Chicago. We think of it in 4 stages. You've already done orientation to teaching a long time ago. You already did the getting started as a TA. And here you are in the stage of independent teaching. It's a critical moment in your teaching development, and it leads ultimately to the last stage, which we're just calling launching, which is where you take everything that you've done while you're here and figure out who you are as a teacher, not only for yourself, but for the market, so that when you are on the market, you can present yourself as a teacher who actually knows how to reach students. And that's what this is all about, knowing how to reach students and help them learn. Couple of things. One thing I want to point out in this, teaching consultations is something that I highly recommend, and I think Joe will talk more about that. This is a good time to get a teaching consultation. Some of you may have noticed in the last few months that there's a new entity called UChicago Grad, which is one of our key partners. UChicago Grad, we work very closely with them to help you move through this process of independent teaching. And I just want to invite you this year to take advantage of things that are coming through UChicago Grad. And I think in the next couple of months, you will actually be able to sign up for consultations and appointments with the CCT around your teaching through UChicago Grad. And then what I want to talk about now is just the schedule for the day, which is on So here we are, day 2. Here we are in Kent Lobby. I am welcoming you. Welcome. Joe is going to talk in a minute. At 9:30, we will go into our first plenary session, which is also in this room. Break, 10:45. 3 concurrent sessions that are organized by division. Come back and grab your lunch here in Kent, and then you have a chance to have lunch with a member of your faculty, just like you may have done a number of years ago when you were a TA. And then 3 more concurrent sessions, one for the humanities, one for the social sciences, and one for STEM, mostly focused on grading and the role of grading and how you grade, and that's always a big question. And then come back to Kent, and we have a final session where we've invited 3 undergraduates to come and talk about their experiences with faculty and what helps them learn. We did this yesterday with the TAs. They were great. It was just really an informative session. John Boyer will come by to say a few words before that session, the Dean of the college. And then finally, yay, 4 o'clock, wine and cheese reception, because it's Friday afternoon, we're all gonna need it. And that'll be held in the CCT office over in Wiebold Hall. And I hope you can all make it. It should be a lot of fun. And just as a reminder, for those of you who are teaching in the core, at 2 o'clock, we'll be going over to Harper for a session on core teaching. So that's the day. All right, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Joe Lampert now, but for now, let me just say, have a great day, learn a lot, and have a great quarter of teaching. Thank you.
Hello. I'm Joe Lampert. I'm an associate director at the Chicago Center for Teaching, and I'm going to talk to you for 5 minutes or less about a new offering that is especially relevant to folks like you who are teaching their own course for the first time. It is a new course we're offering called College Teaching. It is being offered for the first time this fall quarter, and it will also be offered in the spring as well, because the fall quarter is full. But let me tell you just a little bit about it so that even if you're not taking it this term, or you might think about taking it in the spring or next year, the first thing I say about it is that it fulfills the pedagogy course requirement for the certificate in teaching that we offer. So if your department does not offer a pedagogy course, you can take one with us at the center now. Okay, so the basic goal of the course is to help you to prepare and design, and teach your own course. So by the time you're done, you will have the scaffolding for a brand new course that you will then be able to teach. Perhaps it'll be something you teach here at the university. Perhaps it'll be something that you would want to put in your teaching portfolio. Maybe it's something that you will plan to teach in your first year as a faculty member. But the idea is when you take this, you should come in with a specific idea, more or less, for a course that you want to design over the 10 weeks. How do we do this? We'll read a little bit of literature on teaching and learning, just a little bit, just to give you a taste. And we use that to kind of reflect on our teaching practice over the course of those 10 weeks. And as we do that, we develop the different elements of a course. The topics include how people learn. We do a little bit of work on how people learn. And then the approach we use to course design is something that you may have come across if you've talked with me before, called constructive alignment, where we talk about the kind of learning objectives we want to set for students, how to match those learning objectives or align those objectives with teaching methods that will actively engage students in the classroom, and then assess the learning that they are doing so that we have good information on the kind of learning that they're doing, and we are thinking about how to use assessment tasks, writing papers, lab reports, this kind of thing, how to use assessment tasks to produce learning in students, okay? So that's the basic kind of framework that we use, and those are the kind of major elements of the course design project that you would be developing over the course of the term. We'll also talk about inclusion and diversity in the classroom, and we will also have a series of conversations on kind of current hot topics or debates in teaching that are relevant to the things that we're talking about. So for example, when we talk about learning objectives, there is a growing discussion on the bigger question of what is college for? What should it be about? Should it be about producing good workers with good skills? Are there more kind of intellectual goals that should be, we should retain in the college experience? We'll talk about the college essay. Is the college essay where it's at in terms of student assessment? Is this really a productive form for students to be using in their learning? You'll be surprised or not surprised to hear people have feelings on this topic. We'll talk about the lecture. There's, especially around this time of year when students are going back to school, there's always like a spate of articles on whether the lecture is useful, if so, under what conditions, what are its advantages and disadvantages. And we'll talk about trigger warnings this term, and the relative virtues and vices of that kind of dialogue in the classroom. That's the course, more or less. Like I said, the best time to take it would be when you are preparing to teach, or concurrently when you are teaching your first standalone course. So whenever that is for you. If you're developing a course here, if you're developing a course for one of the prize lectureships, if you want a course for your teaching portfolio, or if you just want something to be ready for your first year as a faculty member, that would be the time to do it. Since the fall course is full, I would encourage those of you who are interested to register for the spring. But in the meantime, there are a variety of other things that we can do to support you as you're teaching your own course for the first time. The most important of which is, I would say, our individual teaching consultations. Has anybody had one of these before? A few of you, right? So this is where we will, one of our graduate fellows or teaching consultants will come and observe you teach and give you constructive, anonymous feedback on your teaching. They'll meet with you before the session they're going to observe, have a chat, how's it going, what do you think you're doing well, what are some areas of feedback you'd like me to focus on. They'll come observe you, write up some constructive feedback, and send that to you and have a conversation after the fact. Totally confidential, totally anonymous, and meant to be completely constructive, and you get a nice little report that summarizes their observations for you. I think this is really important and useful. So the first time I taught my own course, I was a graduate student, and I happened to I had a TA who was a colleague of mine, and I was pretty nervous, and I went and I gave my first introductory lecture, and I asked my colleague, who was my TA, do you have any feedback for me? Like, how did it go? And she said, I did great, and she said the one piece of feedback she had for me is I was doing this the whole time, and my wedding ring was like reverberating into the hall, was basically like this. And that was useful. It's good to know not to do this the whole time, because that's distracting, right? But I kind of wanted a little bit more, right? I wanted a little bit more feedback on how I was reaching the students, if they seemed engaged, and some concrete ideas on what I could do to reach students better in the future. That's the goal of our individual teaching consultation. So it's a great service. I would encourage you to do that. And also, just as a catch-all, as you're developing and teaching your own course for the first time, you can also come meet with us as well. This is very easy to do. Send an email if you want to talk about your syllabus. If you want to talk about how it's going, make an appointment, and we are more than happy to meet with you. Okay, that's my spiel. Good. So now we are going to transition to our panel on inclusive teaching, and for that I'm going to hand this over to my colleague Chandni.
Hi everyone, I'm Chandni Patel. I'm the Program Development Specialist at the Chicago Center for Teaching. And like Bill and Joe said, now we're going to do a plenary session on inclusive teaching. So we will be circulating a handout. It's a scenario. All of the materials that we're using for this session are also available on that website with the schedule. So if you need to access it on your laptop, on your phone, on your tablet, if you're on your phone, scroll all the way down and it's right above the map. If you're on your laptop, it's in the upper right-hand corner. So feel free to access those materials there if you need to do that. Otherwise, paper copies are being sent around. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a sense of what we're going to do for this session. So the panelists that we have here each have different roles here at the university. They will introduce themselves in a minute, kind of let you know where they're coming from and the perspectives that they're bringing to thinking about inclusive teaching. And then I'll kind of give you a sense of the agenda after they introduce themselves. So we're going to start with Michael LaBarbera, who's...
Hi, I'm Michael LaBarbera. I'm in the BSCD, BSE. I teach mostly undergraduate courses with some graduate courses in biology, biomechanics, sort of the interface between biology and physics. I also teach a pedagogy course for biologists, which is kind of fun. I have been at the university since 1978. Yes, before you were born. I could be your dad. And I've got the salt and pepper to show it. And I think I'm supposed to be the voice of experience, although I must say that every time I teach, I learn something, so maybe I'm not so experienced. If I have a point of pride, Bill, I don't know if you know this. I once served, well, actually for about 5 years, on the Provost Council on Teaching. And one of our primary recommendations, which we had to push for about 4 years, was to establish a center on teaching and learning, which I'm pleased to see we had done.
Good morning, I am Tamara Johnson with the Office of the Provost. I've been with the university for about a year and a half, and prior to this institution, I worked at Northwestern for 8 years, where I still continue to teach there. I'm a psychologist by training, and I teach a counseling theory and practice course.
Hello, I'm Emily Marker. I'm in the history department, where I've been a graduate student for many years. I'm currently a fellow with the CCT, and today I'll be talking about some concrete strategies that we can all employ to promote inclusive teaching in our classrooms.
Okay, so what we're going to do just throughout the session is we're going to start with this opening brainstorm activity. We're going to use that scenario that was sent around, and Michael is going to lead that discussion. Then Tamara is going to help us with some conceptual framework for thinking about inclusive teaching and kind of the key concepts that go under that larger concept. And then, like Emily said, she will help us think about more concrete strategies and tips when we're all in our classrooms and thinking about inclusive teaching. So I'll turn it over now to Michael, who will give you a sense of how that activity is going to go.
Okay. Yep, here we go. So let me try to set this up for you. What I would like to do is present you with what's basically on this page with a little bit more context. And then I'm going to ask you to find the nearest 3 or 4 people, some of you may have to move or lean over, and talk about how you would handle this in your own classroom. Now you're vets, okay? You've done this. And so I'm expecting real insight in how you're going to handle this situation. You're going to teach me something, I'm sure. So here's the deal. I teach a course called Biodiversity. By the way, I'm driving the guy with the camera nuts, because I'm a lecturer who's also a pacer. And I have trouble standing still. But it keeps the students awake, right? They've got to track me. So I teach this biodiversity course. I have done so for 15 years. It's been as large as 110 students. Right now it's about 40. Depending on where they put it in the curriculum, the size goes up and down. Mostly it appeals to biology majors, typically majors in ecology and evolution, with a few geosci people, and then a smattering of other students who've heard it's a good way to fulfill their core requirements. So I get people from physics, I get people from anthro, I get a few economists, I get people from all over the place. So it's an interesting group, and one where I have to be a little careful to make sure that I'm not losing students who may not have the vocabulary, who may not have some of the concepts, okay? But it's a bit of a challenge. Some years more of a challenge than others. So, one year, I'm giving my intro lecture and explaining how the course grading is going to go and giving some basic concepts, things like evolution by natural selection, and a hand goes up in the back of the room, quite eager. It says, I was just wondering, and I came to dread those words over the course of the quarter. This kid, we'll call him Arthur, had no governor. If he had a question, he would ask the question, which is fine. But sometimes the questions were not exactly relevant to the material at hand. Sometimes it was, I was just wondering, I read this article in the New York Times last week, and does this have anything to do with that? I was just wondering, last quarter in conservation ecology, we talked about oak forests. So, I mean, you have a choice. You can try to answer all of these questions, faster, end up in kind of cul-de-sacs. You can put the student off, and I wasn't quite sure what to do with this kid. And so for the first week or so, he asked a question, I basically answered it as well as I could, which demanded sometimes saying, I don't know, which, by the way, is a really good thing to say when you don't know, to say, I don't know. But one of the nice things about teaching science courses, how many of you are teaching in the sciences? Okay, only a very few of you. One of the nice things about science courses is we have labs, and labs are a great opportunity to really get to know your students. You have 3 hours to schmooze with them. Talking to this kid in lab, it immediately became clear that he was brilliant. He was just amazingly smart. Had no inhibitions whatsoever about asking questions, about throwing ideas out, and also was completely unable to read normal social cues. You know, the face you put on when you say, I am tired of listening to this, didn't touch him at all. He just kept on going. So, at this point, I realized that these questions he was asking was not to interrupt, not to be the center of attention, but really were sincerely bothering him. And I decided that if these were real questions, if these were real issues that he wanted dealt with, I had to treat them seriously. Okay? So, what I want to ask you is, how would you have dealt with this situation? This is a student who anywhere between 2 and 6 times in a 1-hour lecture would raise his hand to ask questions. How would you deal with this? Talk to each other. We'll give you 3 minutes, and then I'm going to ask for reports. Identify someone who will act as a spokesman for your group, so that I have somebody to point my finger at. Love it when the audience spontaneously goes quiet. It's one of those random moments, right, when it lapses in the conversation overlap. So, you've had a chance to talk about this. You all have had experience in the classroom, some of which I'm sure was with some person like Arthur. What I want to know is, how do you deal with this? Yes?
So we are here with him.
So our group had a couple of considerations. We started talking about how the issue at hand is not only this student's learning and wanting to honor the questions when they're genuine questions, but also to recognize that the learning environment of the entire class is an issue. And so it's not only a matter of supporting the student in whatever way is best for that student, but also to support the entire class in a way that's productive for them. So some of the suggestions we came up with were a sort of Socratic method approach of taking the question and reframing it and giving it back to the student in a way that's productive for the class. I mean, that's going to work better clearly if it's a question relevant to the lecture. The other suggestion we came up with was maybe not starting with this, but at some point suggesting to the student that they go and research the topic and report back on it.
Those are good ideas. I'm particularly intrigued that you mentioned the rest of the class, because clearly what you have here is the trade-off between an individual student and the class as a whole. And part of the question is, if you spend lots of time with this student, do you encourage or discourage contributions from the rest of the class? Are you volunteering or stretching? Stretching. Who else? Somebody over here.
I have a microphone here.
Oh, okay.
We were discussing another option would be perhaps to say something like, that's a really interesting question that I'd be happy to talk about in office hours, perhaps, which I'm assuming would be the truth. But I really want to make sure, I really want to emphasize like what's on the board or what we're talking about right now, because this is really important and I want to explore this. And then you're putting the content first and not telling the student to shut up per se, but also reassuring the rest of the class that if you're not tracking what he's talking about or you don't care, like, that's okay. The class is going to continue with the content that we want to do.
Right. Okay, that was good. Come on, we need something from this half of the room, guys. You're over here with the sunshine, you should be awake. Come on, somebody. You guys were talking.
Okay, I had a student like this once in a discussion section, and I basically chatted with her after class, and I sort of explained to her, well, first I talked a lot about how it was so great to have her in class because she had all these ideas, and it was really nice, and I don't know, I guess you sandwich sort of bad news with good news. But then I talked just generally about how, you know, sometimes when we're trying to move in one direction in discussion, people who ask questions that fall outside of that, don't you think that can get class off track? And she was like, oh yeah, you know, she was going along with all that. And so basically what I said to her is, I said, you know, you have so many great questions. What would really help me is if you maybe wrote them down during class when they popped into your head, especially if they're not exactly related to what we're thinking of, because I know, you know, lots of things jump into your head. She wasn't offended at all. She thought it was a really great idea. And the way I was talking to her about it was more that, like, this is an exciting thing. This means you're a great thinker. And then at the end of each class, she would come up to me and we would go through her bullet point list of things that had popped into her head, and we would spend some more time on the things that interested her. And it didn't stop her from contributing to class in a more sort of typical way. She was actually able to filter out the things that were less relevant to the moment. So that worked.
So I think that's a really good strategy. It wouldn't have worked with Arthur. As I said, Arthur had no governor whatsoever. He couldn't stop himself to write it down. He had a question. He had to ask it. Okay. How about Patty? Yeah.
Beth had the really good idea of what I thought was a very good
Hold it right up to your mouth.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Of seeing if there's a way you could kind of deflect the question. So say, that's great, and that will come to focus later on in the lecture. And if there's a way you can even kind of tenuously relate the subjects later on back to the question, if it's not too off base, then you can kind of pull it in. This subject we're going to talk about next has something to do with what Arthur was getting at before, that kind of thing.
Good. Other people. Come on. Share your insights with me. Yes.
We discussed but did not agree about the following. I wanted to share it, which is deferring questions. So just telling the students in advance, all questions will come at the end of lecture. This would then we will not be singling out Arthur when we ignore him, because we are now not accepting any questions during lecture. We also wondered, well, but sometimes as a teacher, you want to be able to fielding the relevant questions during lecture that brings the students in, it might help you in knowing what they're thinking, etc. So we kind of, I think, left undecided on that one.
If I can just comment, and that might work for some people. I know it wouldn't work for me, because one of the things that class questions do for me is make me realize when I've lost them, when I've said something that just went past them and now they don't understand the logic, and if I lose them, I can lose 20 minutes of useful class time, because they're all going, what's he talking about? What is this? What? More people, come on, share. How about here? Yeah, you. So one of the things about being in front of a class, as you know, is you look for the people who are kind of going, oh, I hope he doesn't call on me.
I had something that I was interested in sharing, though, which is that I think part of what we're supposed to do as instructors is help our students learn to contribute to a collective learning environment. So I think that it would be important to say to the student, we need to think about how the questions are advancing the course for everyone else who's involved. So maybe that's hard for a student, but that's part of what they're learning in a college classroom, I think. And this returns to, I think, your remarks about debates, about what it is that we're doing in college classrooms. So saying to a student, you have to think not just about your own interest, but how this is going to affect the learning environment of your other students could be a really productive moment.
I think that's a really good way of phrasing the issue to students, is talk about your classroom as a community of learners in which you are one and the students are another collection, and what you're trying to do is maximize the progress of this community. It takes it away from being, you're doing something wrong, from we want to think about what will most effectively raise everybody up. Other ideas? Did I miss somebody? Anybody? Okay, so what did I do? I thought about this for a while, and I thought about the fact that this kid was asking, I said kid, he's a young adult, but from my perspective, they're all kids, right? This kid meant every single one of these questions sincerely. He really wanted to know. On the other hand, there is this issue of community. I want the entire class to make some progress. And I made basically an internal pact with myself. I said to myself, any question I can answer in 1 minute or less, I will address. Any question that would take more than a minute, I said, Arthur, that's a really interesting question, but I don't have time to deal with it right now. Come talk to me after class and we'll talk about it. Much to my surprise, that was fun. He was perfectly happy with that. The unexpected benefit or side effect of this, there were two. One was Arthur decided I was really wonderful. He adopted me as his unofficial mentor for the next 3 years. He was in my office all the time asking for advice. He took every single course I offered in the college, so I got really good at dealing with it. I wrote letters of recommendation for him. He's now in grad school and doing very well. The other benefit was with the rest of the class, and it was really interesting. It was not at all what I predicted. But he would raise his hand and say, I was just wondering. 4 or 5 people in the class would go. Because they'd been in classes with him for 2 years. They'd seen this behavior. They expected me to go, no, shut up. Good half the class, when those fateful words came out of his mouth, would get this little grin on their faces. And the grin was to see, okay, LaBee, how are you going to deal with this? And that was the really wonderful moment in that classroom. The students saw me being tested as a teacher, that sometimes the questions were relevant, sometimes the questions were not. Would I deal with them honestly? Would I say I don't know when I don't know? And I thought about, oh yes, I'm losing class time, I'm losing the thread of the lecture. But no, folks, I want you to think about the classes that you're teaching. Are you lecturing to give people a tour? This is, by the way, this is a metaphor that was offered to me by a woman named Jeanette Bartley, who taught, now works here at the university, but taught middle school science in the Chicago Public Schools. She says, look, classrooms, lecturers can either offer a tour of the subject matter or a journey. And the difference is really important. The journey is we're going to go together and we are going to learn and we are going to explore as a group. The tour is, we're due at the Casbah in 20 minutes, get on the bus. And whether you want to get on the bus or not, you go. If you teach your class as a journey, then these questions, which seem irrelevant, in a sense are not. You're showing students how to reason through the material, how to start with a limited data set and pose hypotheses that you can then test. It turned out to be, in some ways, the best class I've ever had because this kid kept interrupting me. I offer that for what it's worth. I found it really instructive. Let me turn it over now to Tamara, who is going to talk about, well, give you perhaps a more formal framework on which to settle this.
So you all should have a handout that has my name at the top of it, if you can go to that one. I won't, oh, it's going around. Handout is going around now. So I'm not going to go over the entire handout, but what I think is important, I'll highlight a few things that I think are particularly important. So first of all, when you think about inclusive teaching, what you're really looking at is how can you be the most effective teacher for a range of populations. The most effective teacher for a range of populations that might be in your classroom. And that means trying to connect with them in different ways. That means being aware of different kinds of learning styles. That means being aware of the identities and the backgrounds that come along with the people who are in your classroom. And so sometimes people are concerned about how can I make this classroom inclusive, and what you're really looking at is what factors do I need to consider that will help me to be the most effective teacher. Make sense? One of the things that's kind of interesting, one of the things that I noticed when I came in the room today is that in comparison to yesterday, you all's energy is pretty low. Just feedback, honestly. So if you all were my class, and I'm going to ask you to do this because this is how I do. Remember, I'm a psychologist by training. So in psychology, we do meditation when people need to decrease that anxiety, and then we do things that up your energy when you look like you have low energy. So I'm going to ask you all to stand up for me. So has anybody ever heard of the trembling horse? And you're going to have to put that laptop down or it's going to fall. Anybody heard about the trembling horse? Ever heard of the trembling horse? No. Okay, so what I am going to ask you to do is to wave your hands as hard as you can, both of them. And I'm holding the microphone with one, so I can't help wave both of them. As hard, there you go. That looks really good. Wave your hands as hard as you can. Then now do your elbows. Elbows, hard as you can. I don't see people moving as hard as you can. Hands and elbows. Takes a lot of coordination, doesn't it? Now you're going to go up and down with your whole body. I don't see people going down low enough. You all are a lot younger than I am. All right, you all can sit down. How you feeling? Thank you. Thank you. So So, Ms. Romero, what you are trying to do, and usually the students love it. They love it. They think I am fantastic because I've noticed that they are bored as ever. They are tired. It's either early in the morning or late. It's a Friday, and so they can usually receive it really well. So what you're trying to do is always be cognizant of where your students are, who's in the room, what's the mood, what's the energy, what are the topics. So I'll just really quickly touch on the 3 points that are listed under basic components. One being awareness of self and others. So you're just looking at the different worldviews. And so for me, I am always cognizant that I am an African-American woman. I come from a relatively low SES background. I am the first person to have a doctorate in my family. My mom was actually 15 when she had me. Then ultimately, she went on to get her own doctorate. So now she also teaches she actually teaches at a community college. So I'm always aware of what my perspective is. When I'm in the room with class, with my classes, I always am cognizant of where they're coming from too. And usually I will share pieces of my story so that they can understand where I'm coming from, the lenses that I see life through, and then help them to see a broader perspective as well. Looking at curriculum development, it really just is a design piece. How do you design your class? Some people are kinesthetic learners, which means active, so they really, really like the activities that we just did. So we'll do meditations, or we'll do a range of things that are active in nature. They'll practice counting skills in my class and things like that. Some people are more auditory, and so they just want you to lecture. Just lecture, and they are good because they can take their notes, and that works for them. And then some people are more visual, and so I have the PowerPoint sometimes. I'll do videos and things like that. So you're looking at the creativity that you can bring to the classroom. Then with classroom management, that's kind of like the scenario that we did earlier today. At any given time, there's a range of things that you're trying to manage in your classroom. And the degree to which you will incorporate what you see in a way that facilitates learning is what you're looking at in terms of that classroom management piece. Thank you.
Okay, so as Tamara indicated, our goal today is really to help you think about how to reach all of your students, right? Because you're going to have a diverse group of students. They're coming from all kinds of different backgrounds and learning styles, and we'll need different things in order to participate in the learning process and do it well. So Emily is going to help us think about some concrete strategies that we can use. There's a handout going around now with not her name on it, but it says Inclusive Teaching Strategies, so look for that one.
Hello, I'm glad Tamara warmed you all up for me. I have no physical activities planned, but maybe one will come to me as I'm talking. So what I thought I would do is, instead of sort of going through this handout point by point, I'd sort of talk a little bit about how to read it, how to use it, and also my email address is emarker@uchicago. I should put it on there so you can ask follow-up questions if you have them. What I did was I sort of broke everything up, building on Tamara's framework of sort of curriculum development, classroom management, and awareness of self and other, and thinking about those in sort of discrete categories. And for each of those, there are different strategies that you can use to, really facilitate inclusive teaching. I think that when we think about inclusive teaching, we most often think about classroom management and the kinds of scenario that we were going through with Michael. And then it's a very much sort of on the spot kind of, how am I going to react to whatever situation comes up in class? But those issues, just like issues in curriculum and sort of the awareness category, can really all be anticipated from the beginning. So what I really wanted to stress today is sort of thinking about building an architecture for your class that promotes inclusive teaching from day one. And so that's, thinking about the syllabus, thinking about the assignments that you create, thinking about really everything about the course structure, and then thinking about, each successive time in the classroom, building on that framework and really bringing everyone into the experience. And one thing about thinking about this sort of before stage, the planning stage, is that that's the easiest way to intervene. During a sort of hot moment in the classroom or after something's gone horribly wrong, it's so much harder to undo that and really bring everyone back into the room, right? So the more you can do in advance, the better you'll be for dealing with whatever it is that comes up, and stuff is always gonna come up, right? So I thought I would just talk about, sort of one thing that you could do before in each of these categories. So if you look at the curriculum section, which is on page 1, there's a whole long list of things that I suggested there for how you could think about before, and some of that bleeds into sort of the during, what's going on in the classroom. But one thing that you can think about, especially if you're teaching in the core, maybe with freshmen or sophomores that haven't necessarily been socialized into what the expectations are at this university, that you can also sort of anticipate that maybe everybody doesn't know what it means to be prepared for class. And that's something that you can talk about actively with your students on the first day. So, you can just ask them, what does it mean to be prepared for class? And see what they generate. And that way you're sort of collectively establishing norms and expectations that everybody is definitely on the same page with. In the sort of awareness category, something, this is again, on day 1, getting to know your students, making sure that you do proper introductions, maybe making sure that you get everybody's names right, and not just you, but that other students in the room can address everybody by the name that they go by the pronoun that they prefer, what have you. And I mean, getting to know your students is really tough. There are visible and invisible identities that everybody brings into the classroom, and on some level, it's your responsibility to try and sort of figure that out. So another thing that you can do in terms of building in a structure for that is you can have mandatory office hours. It can be attached to an assignment or something, just so that it's not punitive. You're not like, oh, this kid seems like trouble, I need to get to know him. But that everybody is coming to talk to you at some point over the course of the class, so making yourself available for these kinds of things. And then finally, in terms of classroom management, one suggestion that I have that I think can really be helpful, especially if you're dealing with sensitive material in your courses, but even if you're not, is collectively establishing the norms for like a classroom discourse policy. Instead of putting it on the syllabus yourself and telling people what you expect from them, if you engage students in that process, then they become stakeholders in what they're doing, right? They become accountable not just to you, but to each other. And that can really open up a more productive dialogue, even when things get tricky or hairy or what have you. So with that, I think we'll turn it over to questions. And if you have any questions about anything on these handouts, feel free to email me, or hopefully we'll talk about them now.
And just so you know, I did put everyone's email on the schedule, so you'll see Emily and Tamara and Michael's email addresses there. But let's thank Emily first. And if you have questions for any of our panelists, we will run some mics up and down and take those now. So please feel free to ask anything that's on your mind.
Hello, Enrique Davila. Emily, I was just wondering, that last point you made was really interesting about helping the students become stakeholders. Can you give an example of the kind of method you would use to talk to kind of establish that type of rapport with students at the beginning?
Yeah. So, I mean, especially if you have a discussion class or a seminar class, or you're leading a discussion section, I mean, to just make the first point of discussion how we're all going to talk to each other, right? And so that can also be a way, if you go to Joe's class and talk about trigger warnings and find out how divisive those are. If you're not a fan of the trigger warning, this can be a way of sort of setting up expectations that there's going to be difficult material that we're dealing with in this class. And let's talk now about how we're going to deal with that without, getting into the specifics, just really engaging students with how do you want to be addressed in this class? How do you want to see us handle a sticky situation, right? And see what they say, and they'll have ideas. And then you can kind of manage that conversation in whatever direction, whatever your particular concerns are, right? So something, another thing that you can do, a lot of people put inclusivity statements on their syllabi now, and what you can do is you can have the class collectively author that, right? Say like, okay, if I was gonna have a statement on the syllabus that was about classroom discourse policy, like what would you want in there? And let's come up with it together.
So right, I think finding the balance is, in my view, if this is the goal, the balance you want to strike is between a total plebiscite on the part of your students and introducing some norms that you think are useful and dictating those to them, right? And so I think I think one way of thinking about that is to try and split the difference and to have some scaffolded kind of, you know, norms. If you know that your course, if there are certain kind of hot button issues or potentially controversial topics in the course, to say, be upfront about it. On the first day of class, we're going to be talking about whatever it is that you know, can be controversial. And it's important that we are, you know, establish some norms for what it means to respect other people when we are discussing these kinds of issues. I have a tentative set here. Let me share them with you, right? And build in some flexibility in how you present that, and then have them generate some conversation so they have something to work with a little bit, right? This is kind of the way I've done this in the past.
If I can jump in here, it's good to do this throughout the course, not just at the very first meeting of the class session. So one of the things I've done in all of the courses I teach is around week 5 or 6, I hand out an unofficial, informal class evaluation, where basically what I ask the students is, you've now seen what I do in this course and how I do it, how could I make it better? And I ask, you know, sort of the typical survey questions, but the really important questions, for me anyway, are, if you could change one thing in the lectures, what would it be? If you could change one thing in the labs, what would it be? I tend to get really interesting, focused responses, and if they're good ideas, I will adopt them in the middle of the course, and boy, does that make a difference in that class, to not only ask the students, but actually act on their suggestions. It costs you nothing to do this.
One last thing, I know we talked a lot about controversial topics that might come up and establishing norms with students on how to talk about those. But we also just generally recommend that everyone does it, right? Whether or not you think that a controversial topic is going to come up or not, it's always a good idea to help your students think about how to talk to one another, how to respect one another, and how to make sure that everyone is participating in the ways that they can, right? And it kind of helps them not shut each other down also when they have an idea, even, you know, in a science class that seemingly has no controversial topics, which they do, it turns out. You know, it can help in any class, right? Okay. Did you have a follow-up?
Just wanted to bet on that evaluation. Is it anonymous or?
It's anonymous. I mean, it's as anonymous as it can be, given that it's handwritten. Some of them have pretty distinctively terrible handwriting.
Another thing that the Center for Teaching offers is to have a teaching consultant come do a mid-course review for you. So if you don't want to do it, or you think your students might not be as comfortable being honest with you, even if it is a written anonymous thing, you know, you can have someone else come and talk to them about how the class is going.
Hey, so I have a question kind of for everybody. More on a situation where a student may be in the minority as far as like how they're feeling about something. You say you put something like an inclusivity statement, whatnot. I mean, a lot of students will just nod and say, okay, they're uncomfortable speaking up on it. You go throughout the quarter, you start to sense that some student may have an issue on something, but if you ever address it directly to the class or even anonymously, you're not really picking up on that, but you still kind of just have a feeling that that's happening. Is it best to just adjust your teaching style based off that to address the student directly? How would you deal with a situation where you sense that there may be some underlying issue, but you're not getting any direct feedback about it?
Nobody seems to want to jump into that one. This is the way I would work. I'm not saying that this is the right answer, but my temptation would be to find a situation in which I could talk to the student privately. So if there are real issues, they can be aired, and we can have a real conversation about it. That may not be the smartest answer. I'll let my colleagues respond. But the other thing I do want to add into this discussion is the importance of paying attention to your students throughout the quarter. If you have students who are doing well and suddenly their quiz scores or their essays just collapse, it's really your obligation to go talk to them and try to find out why. So many of these kids, you know, their parents are going through a divorce, they stayed together through high school, and kids in college, and they decided they're getting divorced, and this kid is being ripped apart by his family. I've had more than one woman whose performance collapsed, and after some gentle conversation, it turned out she was assaulted. So you have to be willing to talk to the students and make appropriate accommodations with those students. But don't assume that you know somebody just because they fit into a neat little category. So Tamara says, I'm the first one in my family to go to college and to get the PhD. And that probably didn't surprise you. You said, oh, African-American woman, that's such a great story. And I think it is. I'm also the first person in my family to go to college and get a PhD. And indeed, when I went to graduate school, my father didn't tell his friends for 2 years because he thought it was remedial.
Michael, can I just add something to that? So there will be times when you're going to want to talk to a student about something that happened. Maybe you wish you had said something or done something in class, but you missed the opportunity, right? That this happens. And so you do meet with the student and you talk with them and you find out what's going on. At the end of that, it's a good idea to ask the student, what would you like for us to do next? You know, you don't have to come up with this decision on your own. You know, would you like a class intervention? You know, and they might say, yeah, I would really like it if you would tell the class to stop cutting people off or whatever. You know, and so as long as you're comfortable with it, the idea is don't think that you have to come up with the solution in the class by yourself. Talk with the student and find out what he or she would be comfortable with. And that's usually is it a perfect solution? Well, maybe not, but it's a better solution than trying to do it all in your own head, which I think can be very difficult and very distracting for you. So just a point.
I'll just add one thing to what's already been said. I think that in general, when you see students with any challenges or problems in your class, that as long as the student doesn't feel targeted or called out because you're talking to them after class or you're trying to set up a time to meet with them, it's almost always okay, because you always have to remember that there is a power differential. As much as people might want to say, oh, well, you know, I'm a learner just like you are. If you're the TA, if you are the professor, then there's still a power differential. And for you to reach out, for some students particularly, I spent most of my career focusing on underrepresented students, and so many of them have never went to seek out a professor. They've never went to seek out a TA. It's a very intimidating process for some people, and that's not exclusive to underrepresented populations. But in many ways, if it's a student in your class that's having some problems, there's probably never a bad thing for you to reach out and say, I'm concerned or I'm interested in knowing your perspectives or I noticed this, and have the conversation as long as you're coming from a place of caring.
I was wondering if you could address, so you create spaces of inclusivity, which is, you know, the right thing to do, but what happens when you might encounter perhaps an opinion or perspective from a student that might be considered racist or sexist, and I understand you take the student, you know, privately to talk to them later, but in the moment, how do you create a space of where you have to advocate for the complete opposite of what the student states?
Well, I mean, if it's in the context of a discussion, you know, I like to try and have the students engage with each other over it and see what happens. I mean, obviously it can go off the rails. So you want to be prepared to intervene and, you know, feel comfortable with your own sort of authority to redirect the conversation in a different direction if you think that it's not going to work, and then you sort of revisit it in the next class maybe. But is your question that what do you do when there's somebody's views that are reprehensible to you and have to just...
So I think that it depends on, of course, what the comment is. My experience more times than not is that oftentimes people are speaking from a place of not knowing. And so when they say those things, it might trigger in you this, I can't believe they said this, because for you it seems like it's ridiculous to say. And so I try to typically go at it from a perspective of, you know, they don't have this information. And so to the degree that I can provide the information that's accurate, you know, in the news lately, there's been the talk in terms of Trump being up and speaking and someone saying, you know, Obama is a Muslim and Trump not addressing it. And so in many ways, it wasn't a fact. You know, it's incorrect that Obama is a Muslim. And so he could have, if he wanted to, have said that is not correct information. And so not in that way, because you don't want to shame people if you can avoid it, because you still want it to be an open dialogue. I mean, in many ways, this is a place of learning. And so what I try to consider when I am in those positions is that maybe as a person I'm offended, how do I open up that dialogue for us to have a conversation about the different perspectives? Sometimes I'll say, well, that's an interesting perspective. Do other people have perspectives on this topic? And so sometimes that can also open it up. But if it's just blatantly incorrect information, as the instructor, I typically try to clarify that.
Could I say one more thing? You know, I actually teach on race, and, you know, these are, you know, it's always possible that something like that is going to happen. And what I do try and do is I say from the very beginning, like, we're going to give everyone the benefit of the doubt here. Like, people might say something that really rubs you the wrong way, because you also don't want students really going at it either, like in a place of like personal hostility, right? So if you sort of try and emphasize that and stress that, you know, then it becomes okay to kind of work it out with them. And I mean, that can be one of the most gratifying experiences as a teacher, and this actually goes back to the last comment too. I mean, I had a situation where I assigned a response paper for a video, and I kind of took for granted that everybody was gonna read this video the same way, right? And then we have a conversation about the video in class, and one of my students came up to me and said that he didn't want to hand in his response paper because he didn't think he got it. And I was like, okay, well, that really makes me want to read it, so I need you to give it to me. And he was like, well, I really don't feel comfortable. And I was like, well, let's just go talk about it. And then we talked for an hour, and it was really, I think, it was amazing for me, and I think that, you know, he really got something out of that conversation. So, you know, these are teaching moments. They're the exciting moments, as opposed to thinking of them as the scary moments.
Yeah, so I want to put a big exclamation point on both what Emily and Tamara said there, and put them together. So as it happens, happily, treating people with respect is also good pedagogy, right? So it's good because there's the respect and civility issue, but there's also the teaching issue, right? And there's probably some redirection of back to the evidence, back to the text. Let's think about how to read whatever it is that we're reading more carefully, and see if there is evidentiary support or, you know, something that will help to redirect that conversation in a fruitful manner, right? You know, because you don't want to. You want to find a way of kind of thinking about how to continually to reinforce that idea that is to think about things from the perspective of reasoned argumentation, and happily, you know, that also is a principle of treating people with respect.
You took most of my points, but I just want to reinforce them. It's really important that you not let such things slide, but also give the students the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes words come out of their mouth that they don't understand how they can be heard by other people. And I do think it's important to say, Some people might understand that statement to mean X, and I'm sure you didn't. But I want to emphasize that in this room, this discourse needs to be blunt, but it needs to be civil. And don't make the student rephrase it, because you're putting them on the spot. It's not a useful thing to do. Perhaps the most useful thing you could do is try to rephrase their comment in a less offensive manner so that the conversation continues, but without the emotion.
I think we have time for about 2 more questions, maybe. I want to give, yeah, any person.
So we talked a little bit about the student who's sort of overeager or who makes a contribution that might not sort of line up with the aims of the class in one way or another. By far the sort of more common challenge that I face is eliciting contributions from students who are more inclined not to speak. And given the power differential, and putting students on the spot often doesn't work and is counterproductive to making them feel that their sort of contribution is encouraged. So I'd like to hear more about how to elicit contributions from students who stay silent.
So there are attention hogs, and at first I thought Arthur was an attention hog, and it turned out he wasn't, and that was fine. The other issue that always comes up in classes, though, is making sure that there is uniform participation. In particular, men tend to interrupt women. They tend to want to dominate the conversation. As a teacher, it is your responsibility to make sure everybody's voice is heard. Sometimes what that means is picking on people, and I'm quite ruthless about this. I will go around the class and decide I haven't picked on that woman in the last row in 2 lectures. It's time for her to make a contribution. And I will go ahead and do it shamelessly. Because if, in particular, women don't contribute, they don't realize that their ideas are indeed just as valid as the big mouths.
I would just add that, I mean, in addition to cold calling students, and I think that that's fine. I mean, you create that norm if you just start doing it, right? And people expect it. But I would say that there are a lot of low stakes participation activities that you can create and you'll see this, people that don't talk in the big group, even if the big group is only 15, if you break them into small groups of 3, they're talking. And you walk around, you can hear what they have to say. You still don't even have to push them to be the reporter back to the larger group. The important thing is just that they're getting their voice heard. And usually after that, they'll start to open up more in the larger discussion. I mean, I make a point of telling my students on the first day that if you're struggling with participation, come talk to me. We can talk about strategies for how to increase your participation, which can range from anything to having students prepare a comment and read it. and they'll do it if you suggest that to them. I mean, a lot of these things that we think maybe would make people feel uncomfortable or targeted or a special case, they're really appreciative of you taking the time to address whatever their needs are. But I would just add that, being really aware of participation is sort of requires constant vigilance and a really important part of teaching.
Emily, could I add to that for a minute? Because I think this is something that comes up in every class that has discussion, what to do with the reticent student. And I actually think this is fairly easily solved. And it also can be used to address hot moments, which is in-class writing. So 2 or 3 times during the discussion, either when some big question has been posed but wasn't picked up on, and you want the students to engage with it, you want to engage students who aren't participating, think, why is it that students don't participate? It's often students who don't think as quickly as the ones whose hands are always up, or the ones who don't like to say things until their thoughts are well formed. Those are great contributions, and they often go unstated in class. So if you're teaching a discussion class, I highly recommend couple times a class say, wait, let's stop talking for a minute. And I want to come back to something that Alice said a minute ago. She said, she made this claim, or she raised this question. I'd like for everybody to take a minute and write your answer to that question. Just write, just free write, 30 seconds even. And what you're often going to find is the quieter students are writing like mad, because these are folks who are thinking. And then you can say, Tom, I noticed you were writing like mad, you know? And you are essentially cold calling, but you're cold calling somebody who clearly has something to say. And once you do this a few times at the beginning, you can end up drawing out a completely different group of students in your discussion. In-class writing is your best friend for de-escalating conflict and for drawing out quieter students. So just something to
I
think
just
about.
have one quick last comment with that. I think for me personally, I almost never call out people in class because I've seen people so anxious to speak that they're literally trembling, and so I almost never call people out. However, on the midterm exam that I have a statement that says, out of 80 points, if I were to grade your verbal participation today, what would you rate yourself and why? And typically they will provide a response, and ultimately I will, during the next class, tell everyone, you know, thank you for your honesty, so on and so forth. And almost always, once they have to rate themselves on their participation and they know it's part of their final grade, they will increase from that midterm to the final. So
I'd just add to that. I try and give mid-course feedback on participation, and usually after that they'll also, you know, either come talk to me or start talking.
Very quickly, because I know we're out of time, and we may deal with this later, but I didn't see it on the schedule. How should we get acclimatized with the resources, expectations, and protocols for disability accommodations, or for issues such as sexual assault or family trouble back at home if that becomes apparent?
So what I can do is, after today, add a tab to our schedule kind of on the navigation bar of resources, and then when the survey goes out, we can remind you that they're there. But these, I think you guys can kind of help point to some of those resources, and then we can include links on our website.
Your best friend are the student counseling services. And disabilities. Well, the disability services everybody thinks of, and they're relatively easy to access. And students who have any form of legally acknowledged disability get legally mandated special attention or care. I'm more interested in the student who's having problems of some sort. I've had a couple of students who have done fine and then sort of collapsed academically in the middle of class, and it turned out later that they were on meds and they quit taking their meds. This is not uncommon. The student counseling services will take anybody as a walk-in, anonymously, and give them someone with training to give them advice on both psychological and academic matters. I walked a couple of students down there to make sure they got there. And the wonderful thing about it is they don't need to open themselves up in any way, shape, or form. If they find it useful, they can then get further counseling. But if you aren't trained to do this, I'm not trained to do this, let the pros do it.
And every student has access to student counseling, so if they tell you their insurance won't cover it, it is covered. The student life fee covers that.
And something else is that with your roster, you'll get the college advisor, which can also be a sort of frontline resource if you have a student where it doesn't seem like, it just seems like something is off. You know, you can always get in touch with the college advisor.
So we are out of time, but let's thank our panelists. So as they mentioned, their email addresses are on the schedule. Feel free to send them questions. Feel free to send us questions as well. I want to highlight a few things for the rest of the day before you all kind of disperse to where you're going. So we have a small break. There's still coffee and bagels outside. We also have some CCT swag if you haven't picked up any, so do that. And then there are concurrent sessions for the rest of this morning, organized by discipline. So there's for the humanities and social sciences, there's a session on getting ready to teach your own course that will be over here in Kent 120. There's a STEM session on, I think, conceptual learning, and the room number is on the schedule, which Bill is pulling up. And then there's also a session on teaching in the core. So there's an afternoon session on teaching in the core, and this is kind of a precursor to that. This is more about kind of pedagogical skills and advice and workshopping a little bit, thinking about how to teach first-year students. So I do recommend going to that if you are immediately going to be teaching in the core. Then you'll come back here in the Kent lobby and pick up your lunch. And then your lunch sessions are posted on the board right near the Kent doors. So you'll go to your respective lunch sessions. We have more concurrent sessions in the afternoon, again, focused on assignment design and grading primarily, also organized by discipline. So if you're not teaching in the core and you want to get some advice on assignment design and grading, those sessions are available in the afternoon. And then we'll be back here to hear from 3 undergraduates about different instructors that they've had, different learning techniques and strategies that their teachers have used, has really helped them learn in the classroom. It tends to be the session that is the most well received because it's really great to hear from undergraduates that you're about to teach. So I do recommend that you come to that session if you're able to do that. And then our reception is over in, like Bill said, our new CCT space over in Wiebold. Throughout the day, you'll see staff members that have lanyards. So if you don't know where you're going, you don't know where the rooms are, they're going to be circulating and floating around. So feel free to ask them any questions that you have. They'll direct you to where you need to go. If you can just pull up the morning ones so that we can just get the room numbers. Right, so teaching in the core is in Stewart 105. The STEM group is going to be in Stewart 101, and Human Social Sciences is over here in Kent 120. All right, thank you and have a great day.